Thanks for tuning in. If you enjoy the content, don't forget to hit subscribe and give this video a like. It helps more than you might think. I can no longer stand it. I took the dagger from the drawer and placed it under my neck. Just do it. Stop being a coward. I've reached my end and life is no longer worth living. Nothing makes sense. Why try to fight this thing every day? That was the first entry from 51-year-old James Lawson, dated February 21st, 1921. He was known to be withdrawn, and even at the age of 51, he had never married and had no children. A month later, his brother, concerned after receiving James's letter, decided to visit his home. He didn't know what to expect, but nothing could have prepared him for what he found. On the evening of March 30th, 1921, when his brother entered the house in Willow Creek, the silence felt oppressive, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath. On the desk lay a journal, its edges worn and the leather cover faded. James had written every day for the past 30 days, chronicling the dark descent of his life. What was discovered there, however, was beyond shocking. It was grotesque, a haunting reflection of a mind unraveling. The furniture was spotless, every surface meticulously arranged, as if James had been expecting company. Yet something about the room felt wrong, as if it were too perfect. His eyes fell on the journal, lying open on James's desk. He hesitated, his hands trembling as the weight of dread settled on his chest. What drove him to the edge? He carefully opened the first page, hoping for answers, but fearing what he might uncover. The sun was particularly high that afternoon. I sat in my usual armchair, the thin envelope addressed in my father's familiar cursive resting unopened on my lap. I hesitated, unsure of how to feel. My father and I had never been close. Years had passed since our last encounter. All I could recall when I tried to remember him were distant memories of awkward silences and strained conversations. With a heavy sigh, I tore open the envelope. The news was as expected, yet still felt unexpected. My father had passed away peacefully in his sleep. Somehow, I felt guilty. I hadn't been there to offer comfort or support in his final years, but then again, he hadn't sought it either. The letter also mentioned that he would be buried in a few days. I had to go back home. The word home felt foreign, like a place I hadn't belonged to in years, or perhaps never at all. The funeral was a blur, with only somber faces and hushed condolences from a few people who came around. I stood next to my brother, offering polite nods and forced smiles. Afterward, my brother handed me a sealed envelope and told me that our father wanted me to have it. I hadn't expected that he would leave something for me after all these years, but he had. I held the envelope tightly in my hand. My thoughts raced with wild curiosity about what could be inside. I hated the urge to open it right away, but I couldn't resist. Inside was a property deed, a house and a farm in a distant town, a part of my father's life I barely knew. At first, it didn't feel real. My father, a man of few words and even fewer emotions, had left me a gift that represented a future I hadn't planned for. I rejected the offer at first. The idea of uprooting my life and moving to a strange town seemed absurd. But my brother persisted, reminding me of our father's wishes. Reluctantly, I accepted. Days passed since I'd received the letter from my brother. A farm, a house, a life waiting for me in the distant town of Willow Creek. Gradually, I realized that the neighborhood I lived in wasn't the place for me. The endless chatter had begun to wear me down. I craved peace, somewhere I could connect with the earth and lose myself in the rhythm of nature. But the thought of leaving still felt absurd. I'd spent my entire life here, yet something within me yearned for more, a simpler life, one rooted in the land. I imagined myself tending crops, raising livestock, and living off the fruits of my labor. Days went by, and I knew I had to decide, so I did. I chose to leave. The next day, I began packing my belongings. The day of my departure arrived. With one last glance at my familiar surroundings, I stepped out into the world and boarded the train. The ride was long, but as I stepped off the platform in Willow Creek, a sense of peace washed over me. The town was small, almost quaint, with its sleepy streets and friendly faces, but it was the promise of the farm that truly excited me. As I followed the winding dirt road, the landscape shifted. Hills and fields unfolded before me, and a distant farmhouse came into view. It was exactly as I had imagined, a place away from the noise and chaos of the city. The farmhouse was smaller than expected, but cozy and inviting. The interior was surprisingly clean, as if someone had recently tidied up. The fireplace was stacked with neatly chopped wood, and the kitchen was well stocked with basic supplies. It was almost as if the house had been prepared for my arrival. I should have been happy, but something about it had unsettled me. I hadn't told my brother or anyone else when I had planned to leave. Had my brother arranged for someone to clean the place before I arrived? It was a strange thought, but it seemed like the only explanation that made sense. As I explored the rest of the house, I discovered a small library filled with books, a little bedroom, and a spacious attic. Outside, the farm stretched as far as the eye could see. The rich, fertile soil, the clear stream, and the gentle breeze all combined to create a quiet setting, just for me. The next day, I went down to town to get seedlings and more farm tools. By the time I returned, it was already noon, and the afternoon sun beat down on my back as I swung the axe, chopping wood for the barn. The air was still and hot, and sweat trickled down my brow. After a few minutes of work, I paused and noticed a solitary tree standing nearby. Its bare branches reached towards the sky, and while the trunk was sturdy, the leaves had long since fallen. I walked over to examine it more closely. The ground around the tree was barren, devoid of any fallen leaves or debris. It struck me as odd. Perhaps the tree was simply thirsty, I thought. The summer heat had been unrelenting, and maybe it hadn't received enough water. I grabbed a watering can, filled it from the well, and returned to the tree. As I poured the water onto the dry soil, I imagined the tree lush with leaves, providing shade and shelter for years to come. The next morning, I woke up with the sun in my eyes. I'd almost slept through the morning, not knowing exactly when dawn had arrived. It was strange, considering I'd always been roused by the chorus of birds chirping outside my window back in the old neighborhood. I stretched, yawned, and sat up in bed. But then, an eerie silence settled over the house. It was so profound, it almost felt deafening. The usual sounds, the chirping of birds, the buzzing of insects, were completely absent. I went outside, only to find the world as still as the house. Not a single bird was chirping, nor an insect buzzing. The sky above me was strangely empty. It felt as if the world had been muted. A week passed, and the silence had persisted. Every morning, I woke hoping for the familiar sounds of nature, but they never came. The absence of birdsong was unnerving. One afternoon, I returned from a trip to town, carrying a fresh ham. I placed it on the kitchen counter and went to rest. When I returned, the ham was still there, untouched. Usually, flies would swarm around any exposed food, but not this time. The kitchen window was open, yet not a single fly had entered. My curiosity grew. I cut a piece of the ham and placed it outside on the porch. I returned to the house, glancing back over my shoulder. The stillness of the world outside unnerved me, but I dismissed it. The next morning, I went outside to check on the ham. It was still there, exactly as I had left it. No ants, no flies, nothing. Confused, I repeated the experiment with sugar and biscuits, but the results were the same. Weeks passed, and the world around me remained disturbingly quiet. The absence of life felt oppressive, yet somehow, I had started to accept it. My days became a routine, tending to the farm, watering the lone tree, and avoiding thoughts of the strange emptiness surrounding me. Then, one evening, just as I had walked into the house, a sudden chill made me stop in my tracks. The temperature seemed to drop instantly, making my skin prickle. I turned towards the window, but it was shut tight. My breath fogged in the cold air, and I rubbed my arms for warmth. Then I heard it. Faint, distant at first. Laughter. The sound of children playing, light, carefree, and utterly wrong. I froze, every muscle in my body tense. I hadn't heard laughter or any sound at all in weeks. My rational mind tried to explain it away. Maybe it was the wind or a sound carried over from the town. But as I moved through the house, the laughter grew louder, echoing faintly through the empty rooms. Room by room I searched, calling out once or twice. But there was no one. Nothing. The house was empty, save for me and the laughter that no longer seemed so cheerful. I stopped in the doorway of my bedroom, my breath shallow. The sound was gone. The cold remained, but the silence returned, wrapping around me like a heavy shroud. Exhaustion crept in, and I told myself it was all in my mind, a trick played by stress and solitude. But deep down, I wasn't so sure. As the days passed, the strange occurrences had continued. Whispers, footsteps, and the occasional giggle echoed through the house. Sometimes, out of the corner of my eye, I'd glimpse a shadowy figure. But when I turned, there was nothing there. I tried to ignore these happenings, but the more I dismissed them, the more persistent they became. Was I losing my mind? Or was something truly supernatural happening? Despite the unease, I pressed on with my daily routine, tending the farm, reading books, spending time outdoors. I clung to the rhythm of work, hoping to distract myself. But no matter how busy I stayed, the silence around me and the unexplained noises refused to fade. One night, I lay in bed, unsure if it was morning or still night. In the hazy space between sleep and wakefulness, a familiar melody drifted into my mind. A children's song. I recognized it immediately. The neighbors' kids used to sing it in my old neighborhood. As the tune played on, faint voices joined in, murmuring and laughing, like children playing nearby. I jolted awake, my chest tight and sweat slicking my face. Was I dreaming, or was someone outside? I rubbed my eyes and peered through the window. The yard was empty, save for the lone tree I'd been tending. Disoriented and confused, I got out of bed and walked to the window. The sky, still cloaked in darkness, was just beginning to lighten with the first rays of dawn. I strained my ears, desperate to hear something, but the voices were gone, vanished like they'd never been there. A cold dread settled in my chest. This terrified me. I didn't know what to think, but the only thing that came to mind was that the isolation had begun to affect my mind. I tried to shake off the unease, telling myself it was all in my head. But each time I remembered what I had heard, it would always keep me on edge, a chilling reminder that I was no longer alone. The 21st of February 1921 marked a turning point. It was the day one of the scariest things happened. My mind felt increasingly foggy, as though a veil had been drawn over my thoughts. Fearing I might lose track of reality, I started keeping a journal. It was my only way to document everything, to ensure I wouldn't forget what was happening to me. With no one around to talk to, the journal became both a record and my sole confidant. That morning, I woke up feeling groggy. Stumbling to the bathroom, still half asleep, I was met with a sight that chilled me to the bone. A small, childlike figure stood motionless by the door, its pale hand outstretched toward the exit. I blinked, disoriented, and the figure vanished. Fear gripped me as I approached the door. Scrawled across the wood in jagged, uneven letters were the words, "The box." My hands trembled as I traced the letters with my fingertips. I had never felt such primal fear in my life. Panicked, I retreated to my room and grabbed a pen and paper. I began writing a letter to my brother. Someone had to know what was happening to me. I was alone, isolated, and terrified beyond words. But deep down, I knew my story would sound unreal. Who would believe me? I sealed the letter and placed it on the table, unsure of what to do next. A part of me wanted to flee, to escape whatever nightmare this was. But where could I go? And if I left, would it follow me? These questions froze me in place, trapping me as surely as the walls around me. So, I stayed. The day had been long as usual. I'd spent hours toiling in the fields, my back aching and my hands blistered. As the sun began its descent, I returned home, eager to rest my weary bones. I settled into bed, hoping to drift off to sleep, but a strange noise disturbed my peace. Thumps from the attic kept me awake all night. The footsteps wouldn't let me sleep. When morning came, I went to investigate. I hadn't been to the attic since I had moved in, and it seemed like a good time to finally organize it. I began clearing the clutter and dusting off forgotten relics. While working, I stumbled upon a peculiar wooden box tucked away in a dark corner. Intrigued, I pried open the lid, revealing a collection of old, yellowed papers. At first, they made little sense. Some pages had crude pictures drawn on them, though it was unclear if children had created them, as they were done in charcoal. Deeper into the box, I found some papers tied together. The handwriting was elegant, yet the language was foreign. I recognized it as French, a language I had studied in school. I spent the next few hours poring over the documents. The papers told the story of a young girl, a slave who had endured a life of hardship and suffering. Her name was not indicated. "I toiled all day so my master wouldn't starve," she wrote. "My master was all that I had." The sentence was incomplete, the last word missing. I wondered who this cruel master was and what horrors he had inflicted upon the young girl. As the day wore on, my eyes grew heavy. I decided to put the papers aside and return to them later. The next day I began reading the papers again, but the more I read, the emptier my head felt. I was forgetting things, and quickly. Whatever was in that house didn't want me to read, so I decided to take the papers outside to read them. On one page I read, "My master would visit me every night to warm my bed, treating me like his queen, but in the daytime he would treat me like a slave. This continued until I told him I was with child. The master didn't want the child, and when the slave girl gave birth, she gave birth to twins, a girl and a boy. Everyone saw the resemblance between the children and the master didn't like it, and that's where the paper ended. I didn't know what had happened to the slave girl or her children, but something didn't feel right. So, I went back to the attic to continue looking for more papers. I searched for days but found nothing. I thought the strange occurrences had finally ended, until one day I returned home to find muddy footprints on my porch. The weather had been dry and sunny. Thinking someone had entered my home, I followed the footprints. My stomach tightened when I saw where they led. The prints led to a wall, up to the roof, an impossible path. Then, I heard footsteps from every direction. It felt as if my head might burst. In a panic, I rushed to the kitchen, grabbed a knife and pressed it to my throat, ready to end it all. But then my eyes rested on a part of the kitchen drawer that hadn't opened since I moved in. Inside, I found a journal, this time written in English. The handwriting was familiar. The name on the cover was my father's. My father had been upset when the slave girl had given birth, and people were beginning to suspect him. He wrote, "People started noticing that the children of the damned were mine. I hated it." From what he had written, the children were already 6 years old when my father visited the slave's room again. His intent was simply to tell her to leave, but she refused to abandon her children. A fight ensued, and in the heat of it, he killed her. She was a slave, so no one would look for her. The children woke up and saw what their father had done. Terrified, they fled into the woods. My father wrote that he searched for them but never found them. It wasn't until he fell ill and was taken away from the house that the search ended. As I finished reading the journal, a realization hit me. I knew what I had to do. I needed to find the children. Perhaps that was the true reason my father had left me the house. On March 21st, I will set out to find these children. Perhaps when I find them, I will finally find peace. After reading through James's journal, his brother contacted the authorities, claiming he might know where his missing brother was. A search party was organized to look in the woods. A few days later, they found him. He was tattered and worn, muttering over and over that he needed to find the children in order to be free. He was eventually admitted to a psychiatric facility where he was diagnosed with schizophrenia. You've made it, for now. Thank you for joining on this horrifying journey. If you want more, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and to follow on other platforms. There are many more stories to come, and if you enjoyed this, please like the video. It really helps. Let me know your favorite part or any suggestions in the comments below. Until next time, stay safe, if you can.